Picture this. You're standing in a museum, looking up at an absolute masterpiece from the Renaissance, or maybe the Dutch Golden Age. Usually, we're completely captivated by the image itself, right? The expression on a face, the fold of a velvet cloth, or that brilliant play of light. But today, we're actually going to look beyond the paint. In this explainer, we're diving into the source material to uncover a forgotten, unseen chemistry that made these 500-year-old works of art even possible in the first place. So let's kick things off with a very literal, physical question. What is actually holding a 500-year-old painting together? You see, the pigment, the actual colored dust, needs a binder to stick to a surface and actually survive for 5 centuries hanging on a museum wall. That binder is a drying oil, and today we're zeroing in on one specific, highly intriguing oil. It was a core part of the painter's vocabulary for centuries, but strangely enough, it's been largely forgotten by modern artists. All right, let's get into Section 1. Oils of the old studio. If we were to step back in time into a painter's studio in the 15th and 16th centuries, which was a time when oil painting just exploded and rose to total dominance in Europe, the workbench would look a lot different than it does today. The old masters had this whole family of traditional vegetable oils at their fingertips. Linseed oil, pressed from flax, was undoubtedly the workhorse of the period, and honestly, it remains the standard today. But it wasn't the only option. They also prized walnut oil for its clarity, perfect for crisp whites and pale blues. They used poppy seed oil, which was known for its slow drying time. And then there was hempseed oil, which offered this really careful balance of properties that artists found incredibly useful for specific situations. And long before any modern controversies, hemp was actually foundational to European art. I mean, think about this. The very word canvas literally descends from the Latin word cannabis. For centuries, the strongest, most stable painting supports available, the sailcloth and the canvas they actually painted their masterpieces right onto, were woven directly from hemp fiber. So there is a very real chance that the masterpiece you admire in a gallery is just pigment sitting directly on top of hemp cloth. Now, a quick reality check here. Based on the historical record, we have to be careful with attributions. While hempseed oil is clearly documented in the technical painter's manuals of that era, and we know for a fact it sat right alongside linseed and walnut on the workbench, claiming that a specific master, say Leonardo da Vinci or Titian, definitely reached for it on a specific famous painting, well, that's often more tradition than confirmed chemistry. Confirming its exact use actually requires complex laboratory cross-section analysis. But the crucial takeaway for us is simply this: it was a known, available, and utilized tool in the European oil technique. Moving right along to Section 2, why choose hempseed oil? So you might be wondering, why would a working painter back in, say, 1550 deliberately reach for hempseed oil over their trusted workhorse, linseed? Well, it comes down to shared chemistry. Hempseed is a drying oil, meaning it cures through this fascinating process called oxidative polymerization. Basically, when the oil is exposed to the air in the studio, its fatty acid chains begin to cross-link. They weave together to form a tough, flexible, solid film that permanently locks the color pigment down to the canvas. And this is the exact same chemical mechanism that makes linseed oil work. But here is where the technical differences become a huge advantage for hempseed. It tends to dry more slowly than linseed because it has a slightly lower iodine value. It also yellows less in thin films, and its cured film stays a bit more flexible over the long term. Now, for a historical painter, these weren't just abstract facts. They were essential practical tools. That slower drying time, it allows for hours and hours of wet into wet blending on the canvas. Its clarity beautifully preserves those delicate, translucent glazes layered over one another to create that characteristic Renaissance inner glow. And flexibility means the painting won't easily crack as the canvas expands and contracts as the seasons change. Now, to use these oils effectively, painters really had to master a fundamental classical rule of chemistry: fat over lean. Because the paint film cures from the outside in, every new layer of paint you apply must contain slightly more oil, making it fatter than the leaner layer beneath it. Think about it. If you put a fast-drying lean layer over a slow-drying fat layer, your beautiful masterpiece is going to crack like a dry riverbed. And because hempseed is naturally a slower drying oil, strict adherence to this fat over lean rule becomes absolutely critical to keeping the artwork intact. Which brings us to Section 3, the modern studio shift. Let's fast forward to the mid-20th century. The modern art supply store has drastically altered this fundamental studio chemistry. Just look at what replaced those traditional vegetable oils. We've got acrylics, which are pigments dispersed in synthetic polymer emulsions that release small amounts of curing compounds. Even more significantly, 20th century oil practice became heavily dependent on solvents, things like turpentine and mineral spirits used to thin paint and clean brushes. As occupational health science has well documented, these are major sources of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. Acute exposure causes respiratory irritation and headaches, and chronic studio exposure has actually been linked to neurological effects. On top of that, even modern alkyd paints introduce petroleum-derived binders and synthetic compounds right into the air you breathe.
Let's look at Section 4, a quiet return to tradition.
So this brings us to a quiet, gentle proposal from our source material. This isn't about rejecting every modern convenience, and we aren't romanticizing a past that definitely had its own hazards. It's just a non-reactionary alternative. A painter who works in pure, traditional drying oils, like linseed, walnut, or hemp seed, and completely avoids volatile solvents, is utilizing the exact same elegant chemistry as the masters of the European tradition. When you work this way, your studio simply smells like natural seed oil. No turpentine. You are eliminating VOCs from your breathing space, all while creating a cured oil film identical to the ones that have survived in museums for half a millennium. You aren't doing something exotic, you're just doing something beautifully old.
And finally, Section 5, Practical Advice and Safety. If you're a modern painter tuning in and you're curious enough to test this historical chemistry on your own bench, here are the steps to ensure it actually works. First, you need to buy refined food-grade oil from a supplier who knows how it was pressed, mostly because unrefined oils contain proteins that will ruin the paint film. Second, expect long drying times. A glaze might need 2 or 3 days to set, so you have to plan your layers accordingly. Third, always test things out on a small panel first to see how it interacts with your specific studio's humidity and your pigments. Fourth, as we just talked about, observe that fat over lean rules strictly. And fifth, even though pure drawing oils are low toxicity, ventilate your studio anyway. Stagnant air helps absolutely no one. Okay, listen up, because that brings us to the most important point of studio practice, which I must strongly emphasize. This is a critical, well-documented fire hazard. Always, and I mean always, dispose of oil-soaked rags properly. Remember that oxidative polymerization process we talked about? It actually generates physical heat as the oil cures. So a crumbled pile of rags soaked in drying oil can easily reach ignition temperature and literally self-ignite. You absolutely must place them in a sealed metal container filled with water or lay them completely flat outdoors to dry. This single habit is, without a doubt, the most important safety practice in any traditional oil-based studio. So before you sit down at your easel next time, I want you to consider this quiet, slightly provocative question. Look at the tubes, the bottles, and the mediums around you. What is actually in the air of your studio, and does it really need to be there? Or is there a material already sitting there on the historical record that might let you paint just a little closer to the masters with a little less standing between you and the canvas? Thank you for exploring this fascinating chemistry with us in this explainer. Keep asking questions, and as always, keep learning.